At 42, the apartment feels quieter than ever. At 27, silence slowly replaces conversation. At 42, dinner is just one plate on the table. At 27, arguments replace understanding. At 42, boxes carry memories out the door. At 27, distractions replace attention. At 42, old photos bring heavy thoughts. At 27, quiet dinners grow colder. At 42, long walks happen alone. At 27, work slowly replaces time together. At 42, lawyers explain the end of the story. At 27, money arguments begin the tension. At 42, nights feel longer in an empty home. At 27, phones replace eye contact. At 42, the living room feels unfamiliar. At 27, small responsibilities become big arguments. At 42, mornings start with quiet coffee. At 27, late arrivals slowly build resentment. At 42, restaurants feel lonelier. At 27, date nights quietly disappear. At 42, therapy becomes a place to reflect. At 27, conversations slowly stop. At 42, the ring finally leaves the finger. At 27, emotions go unheard. At 42, family photos feel heavier. At 27, small fights grow louder. At 42, the couch feels too big for one person. At 27, screens replace presence. At 42, empty rooms echo memories. At 27, blame replaces responsibility. At 42, signatures finalize the separation. At 27, small issues go unresolved. At 42, gatherings feel different now. At 27, feelings are dismissed. At 42, quiet parks invite reflection. At 27, stress becomes an excuse. At 42, papers explain the legal reality. At 27, friends slowly come before the relationship. At 42, moving out feels heavier than expected. At 27, serious conversations are avoided. At 42, dinner remains untouched across the table. At 27, phones dominate the conversation. At 42, streets feel longer at night. At 27, apologies arrive too late. At 42, dim lights fill the apartment. At 27, daily arguments feel normal. At 42, the lawyer's office becomes familiar. At 27, concerns are dismissed. At 42, wedding albums close slowly. At 27, plans begin to disappear.